Hello everyone. Today we're going to be taking a look at section 3 of the 28th Metaphysical Disputation of Francisco Suarez. The disputation is on the first division of being and into the absolutely infinite and finite, and the other divisions which equate to this, and the section name is whether the aforesaid division is univocal or analogous. So this is going to be on the topic of whether being is said univocally, equivocally, or analogously to God. So a univocal term is a term where the meaning is the same, an equivocal term is a term where the meaning is different, and an analogical term is a term where the meaning is similar. So we have the first opinion, that the division between God and creation is equivocal. This position was held by Rabbi Moses, or Maimonides. He held that there was no proportion between God and creatures, that there was no sameness in any way. This would be pure equivocity. There's nothing which is similar or the same between God and creation. And his reason for this is that if there was a proportion, there would need to be a finite bound of the difference between the perfection of God and creatures, but there isn't. So there is no proportion. For any creature which exists, God is infinitely greater than that creature. There's no finite difference between them. And as such, there is no proportion between God and creatures. And then we have the arguments against. The first one is knowledge of God. If there's no proportion at all in any way between God and creatures, then nothing could be known of God, but things can be known of God. Therefore, it cannot be equivocal. So this is kind of easy to see if you think about like humanity. So think about a human. We've got the humans we see. Sometimes they die. The Socrates was living a couple thousand years ago. Socrates also died, as a human. That's kind of what humans do. Sometimes they come back, but usually they just die. Now, we know that about Socrates partially because we know that humans die. There's this thing which is the same about the humans that we experience and Socrates. They share this human nature. And because of that, we can know certain things about Socrates. But if there was nothing the same between Socrates and the humans we know today, if Socrates of the past and Socrates of today were completely different in every way, then Socrates of the past, we would have no way to know anything about him, because he would share nothing in common with the stuff that we experience. And the same goes for God. If there's no proportion at all between God and creatures, then nothing could be known of God, because we wouldn't have these objects in our experience which tell us about God. The second is being. Being is said in proper proportion to God and creatures because there is some proportion or agreement between them. Even if they don't agree in power or perfection, maybe they still agree just in the very bare, confused idea of being as such. Okay. Then we have the second opinion, which is that of Blessed John Duns Scotus, which is that being is said univocally. Being has the same meaning in all creatures that it applies to, and it has the same objective concept. It signifies the same thing in the world in all creatures that it corresponds to. There are a couple arguments for this. The first one is that analogy requires some univocity to make sense, and the univocity present is what being signifies. So if you think about two terms, you could have one which is the same in both instances and one which is different. And then if you kind of mesh these together in your mind, they'll be similar, but they won't be the same term. So there's this, for analogies, the charge is that we require this idea of at least one of the terms is the same, and one of them is different. Now, we'll see later that there are some kinds of analogy which don't require this univocity, though Suarez will not accept those, as we'll see later. The next argument is that other kinds of analogy that don't require this univocity either require proportionality or attribution, which will be explained shortly. But the word being is said neither with proportionality nor with attribution. Therefore, it is said without analogy. So it must be univocal. And then finally, being can be conceived in a complete way prior to knowing God. So when we come into contact with the things in our everyday experience, we have this idea of being which we draw from them. But when we think of God, we don't need to create a new idea of being or existing. The idea is the same between God and creatures. Okay. Then we have the third opinion, which is that the division is analogous. There is something similar between God and creatures, but there's nothing which is the same. Now we have the position that the term being is applied analogously to God and creatures, and we have an argument for that. But first, the idea is that being is said primarily of God, and then it's only said of creatures with reference to God. And then this is entirely argued from the impossibility of other opinions. So it's not that analogy makes some kind of special sense, but it's that all of the other opinions have some problem with them, or at least this is what the proponents of analogy will say. So first, causes are equivocal with the effects they produce. Causes don't produce themselves. Now, this is supposed to be taken in the sense of a Metaphysicae ordered causal series, or an essentially ordered causal series. This is not a series which crosses over time. The reason this is important is because causes over time, these accidentally ordered causal series, are capable of producing effects that are not equivocal. You could produce another human by, performing coitus. But angels can't do that. Angels can't create other members of their own species by their own power. They can only create beings which are lesser than themselves. So in this sense, causes are equivocal with effects. Maybe there's some kind of similarity, but there is a serious difference between them. Then God produces everything, so God is equivocal with everything else in existence. There is a reply to this, which is that this does not apply to the transcendentals. So even when there is an equivocity between the kinds of things which are produced and the producer, they still share things like being, unity, goodness, and truth. And then Suarez says that the reply to this is apparently that none of these aspects are equal between the cause and the caused. He'll reject this in a minute. Then the second argument is that the character of being in God essentially includes every perfection, but creatures' being does not include every perfection essentially, so creaturely being is of a different type. Then he has a riposte. He replies to both of these arguments that they either prove nothing or too much, for they would prove that there is more than one objective concept of being. Okay, so first, for the word objective concept, what we mean is the thing which corresponds to our idea. So we have the idea of being in our mind, and then there is the objective concept of being, which is what the idea is about. However, Suarez rejects that there is more than one objective concept of being, so he also rejects that both of these arguments are functional. But he still wants to hold to some kind of analogy, so he's going to look at the different types of analogy that are on offer. The first one is called analogy of proportionality, which is held between Aquinas and Cajetan. Then there is analogy of attribution, which is held by Ferrara and Fonseca. And then there is the position that it could be both kinds of analogy. So first, we have two failures. That is that there is no analogy of proper proportionality, because there's no proportion between God and man. God is infinitely greater than man. God is infinitely greater than any created thing. And as such, there's no proportion that could be had for between God and creation. Real quick, though, just to explain the idea a little bit more, when you have two numbers, say the number 4 and the number 8, there's this analogy of proper proportionality where they both have the common denominator of 2. 4 is divisible by 2, and so is 8. Another example would be Blessed John Duns Scotus's Hechaeity. Hechaeities are internally different. Every Hechaeity is entirely unique from every other Hechaeity. However, they have the same effect on the beings that they exist in. So my humanity has a Hechaeity, which is completely different from everyone else's Hechaeity, but it does the same action. It makes my humanity a unique thing. It makes my humanity something which is unrepeatable in the real world. And everyone has one of these Hechaeities that makes them an unrepeatable singular object. Now, the analogy here isn't internal. The Hechaeities are all different from each other, but they all have the same effect. So this would be an analogy of proper proportionality, where they relate to something external to themselves in the same way. Then, the first kind of analogy of attribution is also a failure. So analogy of attribution is when you have multiple objects which are related to a third object. So if you think of urine and a human and food, you can call all three of them healthy. Urine is a sign of health, food is healthy if it causes health, and health is what's called the primary analogate, where the other two ideas are related to health in the person, and they're called healthy with respect to the person. But unfortunately, well, maybe not unfortunately, but unfortunately for the analogy of attribution, there's no third object which God and creatures are both related to in this way, and so there can be no analogy of attribution to a third thing. For some reason here, Suarez decides that he will explain what the Platonists mean when they say God is above being. So I'll do this very quickly. So the Platonists, when they say God is above being, they're saying that God, or the One, is something which is utterly simple, and our ideas of being don't apply to it because our ideas of being are composed with the other ideas that we have about created things. So when they say God is above being, they don't mean he doesn't exist. They mean that there's something which is far above our individual ideas of existence. And he cites Pico della Mirandola as someone who held this. I just thought I would add that in because I like Pico. I might do a video on some of his stuff another time, but not today. Okay. Then we get back on track with the two different analogies of attribution. These are supposedly two different versions of the analogy of attribution. The first is the one that I already explained, which is the analogy between a person, food, and urine, and the term healthy. And the second kind is a little bit more interesting. It is on the subject of being, between substance and accident. So there's what you are, there's your substance, your substantial form, and there's the accident. So you could be a human, and your height could be like 5'3". Maybe you're a short guy. You're a real manlet. Still human, but only barely. Now, the word being is truthfully applied both of your substance and your height. They both exist, but they exist in slightly different ways, because one of them exists in itself and the other exists in another. So your height exists in you, but you don't exist in another. You're caused by God, but you don't exist within God. You're not an accident of God. Now, the differences between these two kinds of analogy of attribution are pretty stark. For one, the first kind doesn't have a middle term. So a middle term is a term in a logical demonstration. Think of the syllogism, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. There's this neat little thing where in the premises, in premise 1 and in premise 2, there is a term which is the same, which doesn't appear in the conclusion. which is men, or man, or human. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. Now, this middle term is used the same in both instances. So this second kind of being is capable of acting as a middle term, whereas the first kind is not. You can't learn anything through demonstration from this first analogy of attribution, but the second analogy of attribution has a middle term, so you can learn things about the other analogates from the first one just by applying the middle term. Second, there's no formal commonality. There's no intrinsic sameness between the urine, the person, and their food. But there is an intrinsic sameness between the substance and the accident. And then finally, the first analogy of attribution has no intrinsic attributions, whereas the second does apply to something intrinsic to the object, not extrinsic to it. Then we have the resolution of the question. Suarez thinks the second analogy of attribution is the one at play here. It is sufficient for a middle term. It has formal commonality and intrinsic similarity. There is this kind of similarity between God and creatures, but it's only through these very bare, confused ideas of being. Now, if I'm being honest, I have a hard time distinguishing this between what the scholastics would call analogy of inequality, which is a kind of analogy where there's one univocal term and one equivocal term, like I explained much earlier. This sounds like a kind of univocity to me, but there are reasons that Suarez gives for thinking that this isn't univocity by itself, which we'll see in a minute. Now, there are two things that Suarez has to show: that there is an attribution or a relationship between God and creatures, and that this relationship is strong enough for an analogy. The first one is easy enough. All creatures only exist with reference to God sustaining them in existence. They have participated being, whereas God has being through itself. There's also this idea of God being the exemplar cause of beings or being. So an exemplar cause is kind of like the greatest member of a genus. So there's like the set of all beings, and then there's the greatest being, and that is God. God is like at the very top end of the scale of perfections that the universe contains. And as such, he's what they call the exemplar cause of the other beings. This is an idea that you'd find if you were reading St. Thomas Aquinas' Fourth Way. Then finally, we have the idea that this attribution is strong enough for analogy. Now, being is common to God and creatures. Its objective concept is common. Now, Suarez claims that it's not univocal, for univocals are indifferent to their inferiors, but all beings other than God are only being with reference to God. So it sounds like he's saying here that being is primarily said of God because God is necessary, because God exists through himself, and that it's said secondarily of creatures because they don't exist necessarily. Now, if I'm being perfectly honest again, this sounds like a kind of univocity to me with different attributes which are applied to the univocal concept of being. But however, Suarez is committed to the idea that it's only analogical and that there's nothing which is genuinely univocal between God and creatures. I hope you learned something.